Welcome to Rehash.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Sari Azout, founder of Startupy, about the different models for online knowledge share that we've seen to date, how big of a role humans should play in curating content online, and what a decentralized search engine might look like. Startupy is a human-curated search and discovery engine for the internet's best knowledge. Sari was nominated by me, Diana Chen, and voted onto the podcast by Triumph, LDF, Ninty Nick, and myself. Before we dive into our conversation, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects that helped make this season possible.
Social media wasn't designed for ads and algorithms. It was made for people. And at Lens Protocol, we're putting people back in control. We're not looking for users' data. We're here to build a community of collaborators, builders, artists, and dreamers ready to unlock a new world of social media. This isn't just an app. It's a flourishing ecosystem of platforms and experiences owned and operated by the developers and creators who are bringing it to life. In the Lensverse, you don't just own your content, you own everything. Your data, your connections, the value you bring to the table, it all stays in your possession, exactly where it should be. As a creator, the Lens ecosystem offers a new set of tools for connecting with your audience. Your data is truly portable and belongs to you. Post once and distribute everywhere in the Lensverse. You can even take your followers with you from app to app. As a developer, you can skip right past building the base layers and scaling your users by plugging your new app directly into Lens's existing infrastructure and community. So whether you create with a brush or a camera, sound waves or lines of code, it's time you got your due. Come create the future of social media with us on Lens Protocol. Lens is the last social media handle you'll ever need.
Have you seen how epic Ambire Wallet is?
How epic it is?
Yeah, cue the music. Ambire is a Web3 wallet that makes crypto self-custody easy and secure for everyone. Instead of relying on clunky seed phrases, you can create an account with the hardware wallet or username and password, secure it with two-factor authentication, and regain access with Ambire's cloud recovery. Need to pay out some contributors or execute a bunch of trades? No problem, Chief. Queue up as many transactions as you want, and when you're ready, execute the entire batch at the same time, paying gas only once. You can even prepay for gas with stablecoins or Ambire's native wallet token, which will get you some cash back. Without ever leaving the Ambire interface, you can manage assets from over a dozen chains, safely migrate them with Ambire's built-in bridge, and seamlessly interact with dApps like Uniswap, Aave, and Snapshot, all within the same transaction. Plus, Ambire is constantly growing their dApp catalog with trusted partners and collaborating with builders who want to establish the new standard for smart contract wallets. So, pretty epic, huh?
Yeah, I already know all that though. I've had an Ambire wallet for months.
And you didn't tell me?
You never asked.
To get involved and truly own your assets, go to ambire.com.
How was your day?
Bad.
What happened?
I bought some NFTs and then they just disappeared.
Sounds like your NFT creator should have used NFT.storage.
NFT. What?
NFT.storage. Come on, I'll show you. With NFT.storage, anyone can easily upload their NFT data to a decentralized and reliable storage network, completely for free.
Wow! How does it work?
Well, instead of relying on centralized and impermanent storage solutions, NFT.storage uploads your files to IPFS and Filecoin. These are powerful peer-to-peer networks that are made for the decentralized web. Thanks to IPFS's unique storage system, you can be confident that once your files are uploaded, they'll be accessible from anywhere in the world for as long as you'd like. They're already trusted by some of the biggest names in Web3, like OpenSea, Magic Eden, and Rarible. By adding files to these networks for free, NFT.storage is helping to turn proper NFT data management into a public good. This will ensure that NFTs will remain accessible and secure in the long run, so you won't get rugged again.
Gee, so I just upload my files and NFT.storage will take care of the rest?
Now you're getting it! Go to NFT.storage today to upload some NFT data of your own, for free. And be sure to follow NFT.storage on Twitter, @NFTDOTStorage.
So without further ado, here is our guest, Sari. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me, Diana. Excited to be here.
I'm super excited to talk to you. We've had conversations in the past about curating content online and about what decentralized search might look like. And I'm so curious to hear your thoughts again, maybe a year or so later since we've last, had a conversation on this topic. So I'm so happy you're here today, and there's so much to cover. So let's just go ahead and dive right on in. The first thing I want to talk to you about is online knowledge share. This is a very broad topic. So I just want to start from sort of the past and how we got here. So let's go all the way back to when online knowledge share first became a thing. And I would say that was probably back in 1989 with the creation of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee. So let's start there and sort of like go through history and go through some of those big milestones that we hit. And I'd love to just get your thoughts on each of these and sort of the role that they've played in getting us to where we are today. And if you have any thoughts on, was this a good thing, a positive thing, a negative thing, somewhere in between, any kind of commentary you want to share, I'd love to hear that. So,
all right, this is a huge topic, but let's dive into it. So,
huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, all right, it's interesting that, of course you mentioned like 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, but even just like to put things in more historical context and, just to understand the value to organizing information, like many hundreds of years ago, information was passed down orally. You had no way of knowing what existed, what thoughts people had, what was out there. Then, you had like projects like the Library of Alexandria. I think it was around like 300 BC or something. And it wasn't the first library, but it was like, probably the most ambitious project. And that's why it was notable. And then, of course, like when the internet came around, because Alexandria, you saw that it became a flourishing place, the intellectual capital of the world. I forget like what the discoveries and inventions that came out of it, but there's a clear value to that, having this library, what that did and how that unleashed people, but it was still sort of bundled with the geography. Now, what's interesting is like once the internet came around, you started to see, the knowledge that you have access to is not necessarily tied to where you are geographically. I think in the early days of the internet, it was still very much like the skeuomorphic days where like the New York Times would have their print articles digital. And it was, in some ways like the nostalgia days where we didn't really realize what, putting all this stuff in feeds and algorithms would do. And then, of course, there are forums and, it was fairly like decentralized, of course, depending on what definition of decentralized you use. But there were no like big centralized parties like intermediating our relationship to content online. And of course, that began to change with the rise of Google and social media and, Wikipedia. And, of course, each of these models for knowledge sharing is very different. So Wikipedia, I believe that like the internet should look more like Wikipedia. So in some ways, we could put that example on the side. But, if you think about like the history of the internet is really the history of making the cost of publishing zero. I think what's unique, or what I would want to emphasize in this question of knowledge sharing, is not just like how we share knowledge, which of course has changed. We now have TikTok and Twitter and Instagram, but I very much subscribe to Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message," which basically the theory there is that the mediums that we use to share knowledge don't just alter the way we share knowledge, they also change what knowledge gets shared in the first place. And I think that's really, really important as we talk about a more human internet, and I'm sure we'll come back to this. But, when you think about Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, they have a lot of things baked into them that impact the things that we share. So for example, everything has a number of likes attached to it. So I would argue that makes these networks more about performance than about communication. So little things like that, I think, really have affected the trajectory of knowledge sharing online. When I mentioned earlier that the internet should be more like Wikipedia, a lot of those like incentives for performance aren't built in the same way. And I think a lot of the reason I believe that we are drowning in information but starved for knowledge is largely a result of the way that these platforms that mediate our relationship to the internet are designed.
Yeah, I think the biggest criticism to Wiki is probably just that the information on Wiki is sometimes not accurate or not verified and not trustworthy. It's for a while people were kind of joking, oh, where did you get that information from? Did you like Wikipedia it? And so that's kind of, the biggest criticism I've heard for Wikipedia. But I do think that it is difficult to focus on this communication piece and this knowledge share piece without having any sort of incentive mechanisms like, the likes or the social verification. Not that social verification is foolproof, because as we've seen, the fake news can make its rounds in the mainstream pretty easily as well. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, like with regards to that Wikipedia piece specifically, since you called that out as like, this is what the internet should look like. Do you have any hesitations about, like using that Wikipedia model, and what would you want to see changed about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of misinformation and all of that stuff, like it's in some ways, like, I'm not an expert in this, but I think it's an intractable problem in the sense that I don't think it's unique to the internet. I think the speed at which misinformation gets spread is unique to the internet. But, before the internet and rumors and harassment and all this stuff, like that's been like an issue forever. And, I read a piece recently by Noah Smith, and I think it was called something like "The Internet Wants to Be More Fragmented." And basically, like the basic argument was that we are not born to live in this global hive mind where we have to bring like groups of people from very different, like, mindsets and social and cultural contexts and like have them agree. And that the early days of the internet, when you had forums, like they worked because it sort of mimics more closely the way that people actually like interact in real life, which is like, social groups exclude people who don't fit in. Right. And like the work of like policing is done by moderators who like, it's a labor of love by these community members. And if you don't like a forum, you just walk away. And so I think a lot of these problems are a result of like just this, I wouldn't call it failed experiment, because I think there's, I'm like careful about the binaries here, because I think there's been a lot of value to having these like centralized and aggregated spaces, but I think a lot has been lost as well. So, I don't know that like misinformation, I think the truth has always been pretty gray, and it's amplified when you put everybody in one town square, right? I think Wikipedia, I'm not an expert, but I believe that Wikipedia, at least like the way that like anyone can come in and edit and suggest. And so there is this like canonical page that is constantly like up for revision. And, while the model is imperfect, in some ways, I find it astonishing that we were able to coordinate humans to create something like that, especially because there is no financial incentive. So, as flawed as it is, I find it to be like an incredible human accomplishment.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to something you said earlier about sort of this like centralized versus decentralized piece, and how the internet at its origin was meant to be, this more decentralized model, this more open source model. When we look back over the last few decades since the internet became a thing, we see that there's kind of this push and pull between centralized and decentralized, between open source and closed, between all of these apps. So, it started out kind of decentralized with these online bulletin boards, forums, where you can kind of just enter and leave as you please if you like the forum or not. And then we sort of shift into this like social media space where it's much more centralized, it's much more controlled. But at the same time, we're also seeing, open source software, online communities around open source software, such as GitHub and Stack Overflow, that are kind of rising up around the same time that social media did, and sort of has this like totally different mentality as social media. And then, later on, we kind of like have also forums like Reddit and Quora, which also are a bit, kind of like brings us back to the early days of those like message boards, bulletin boards that we had in the 90s and the early 2000s. And then also at the same time, these like online learning platforms, these MOOCs like Coursera and Udemy, which spread, you can get an education, you can learn about a certain topic from anywhere in the world from the comfort of your own home. What do you make of this almost like dual progression of more centralized learning platforms versus decentralized learning platforms? Because I don't really know what to make of it personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic like bundle and bundle. So if you think about centralization, like I personally, I think another sort of like way to think about it is through the lens of aggregation, right? So, the reason it's a lot more practical to index the internet like using one search bar so that you can, I don't know, you want to look at the menu for the restaurant you're going to tonight, or find like Google is like one search bar for the whole web. It's, I think initially Google was not even going to be ad based. It was their business model was meant to be like licensing information. So there is like a very clear sort of utility to having a lot of these things aggregated in one single place. And similarly with Instagram, you don't want to have to go to like your, like all of your friends like blog posts to see their images. Like there is a benefit to aggregation. I think that the problem is that the internet, initially, like when a lot of these platforms came up, there was this like narrative around like democratization of access and democratization of information. And, a few years later, when these companies became behemoths and had more power than, many of the world's governments combined, then we started to be like, oh, maybe this narrative of democratized access and information doesn't really hold. So I think a lot of the question is a question of power. It's like we've, in some ways, like we went from a world where the gatekeepers of media were all of these like big media companies, whether it was like Fox or CNN or whatever. And now we have like a new intermediary. They're just like a lot more powerful. And so, we can talk about like platforms versus protocols and a lot of the new models that are emerging as we continue to learn what's worked and what hasn't. I think the thing that worries me and that I think is like wrong about the internet is how everything sort of looks the same, in the sense that in a world that is ad-based, I think I opened like Pinterest, TikTok, Spotify now. They all have stories. Twitter, I think, got rid of fleets, but they're all so similar. It's like there's like this race to the bottom. And you mentioned GitHub and Stack Overflow, and I think that those examples offer different metaphors for information. So I think if you think like truth should follow more of a GitHub model. So as soon as something is factually wrong, imagine if somebody could come in, easily correct it, make it visible to everyone. And so I just think that the greatest minds of our generation are thinking about how to get us to click more and spend more time on these sites versus getting us to generate more consensus on truth. And so I guess like my biggest critique of this stuff is that, yes, the Stack Overflows, whatever, like they're on the edges. It's great, but the big intermediaries of information are just 100% optimizing for us continuing to scroll versus optimizing for the true sort of human qualities such as learning, connection, and whatnot.
Right. So let's talk more about one of those big intermediaries, Google. We've brought it up already. Google is, this is not like a stat I pulled, but I'm sure it's like number one way people get information online is anything that comes to mind. Though most people will hit Google and ask the question on Google and find their answer, which is great. But we know that there are also a lot of problems with Google with tracking our data, with, the way that their algorithm works and stuff like that. Can you first just help us level set by explaining a little bit about some of those issues that we're seeing with Google that we maybe want to fix?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think my biggest issue with Google is that, any network is only as good as people's inability to game the system, right? And so with Google, everything becomes about gaming the system to rank higher in search results. And what that's meant is that, if you, Diana, write an incredible essay or, post on your blog about something, but you don't spend a ton of time optimizing for SEO, you just don't stand the light of day. And for me, the most interesting stuff on the internet is happening in these like chaotic, beautifully human, buried corners of the web that nobody is indexing in interesting ways. And so, I don't want to like negate the astonished accomplishment that is like, indexing the entirety of the web and, even just like programmatic advertising, which you could argue is like the original sin of the internet, is from an engineering perspective, an incredible feat. I think that if I Google like how to achieve my goals, like how to find meaning, how to like all of these like niche queries, you're just going to find a ton of junk on Google. And I want to find the interesting perspectives by real people. And I just, I just think that in a system that is optimized for SEO, that will never happen. And so I don't think that the answer is necessarily replacing Google. I think it's giving people more choice about how and where to access information.
Okay, so talk a little bit more about what that looks like in practice, because I've tried imagining a future of decentralized search, and I think my brain, immediately goes to like a skeuomorphic Web3 version of Google, and that may not be the right way to think about it. I think, would you say that the right way, or maybe like one productive way of thinking about decentralized search, is actually to think about what a decentralized curation of content would look like from the human side?
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time on this question, and I'm happy to just like share all of my learnings. But, it's interesting that my sort of history or context, personal story on curation is I've always been obsessed with hanging out at the edges of the internet and curating that stuff, initially for my own personal use. I just find that the internet is more beautiful and exciting when you consciously curate it and collect it versus mindlessly consume it. So every time I'd find something interesting on the internet, I'd add it to my own personal repository. And, it just changed my relationship to the internet in a really great way because because I have this like beautiful sort of like vessel, I'm just like, it's making my content consumption a lot more conscious. So, but this was still very much a private activity. But the more this thing grew, the more I thought, okay, this is something that more people should have access to and that more people should be able to contribute to. Because if we manage to scale this, then this is essentially a human curated search engine, right? And so as I thought this through, my sort of mind instantly went to incentives. Like everything, the world is governed by incentives. Tell me the incentive and I'll tell you the outcome. And so, initially, when I was building Startupy, I thought, okay, how do we incentivize people to contribute? And this is where I went like deep into Web3, just like as a scholar, just trying to understand it. Not really, I came in with just like a lot of open-mindedness, but, in theory, if you could incentivize people to contribute to this graph, and money could flow towards like people that were producing value versus to the centralized intermediary, then there would be something there. I think that in practice, I guess there's a very big gap between theory and practice when it comes to token mediated networks, or even take the token aside, any sort of situation where financial incentives coexist with intrinsic incentives is just extremely tricky. What we found as we seeded this community is that the most valuable contributors were not motivated for financial reasons, and that designing a system that would compensate people for their work was very hard to do in practice without it leading to some of the same mistakes that were made that have allowed for this like gaming of SEO that we saw. So it doesn't, so I think that when you think about decentralization, there are many ways to think about it. One is decentralized ownership. You think about like financial intermediaries and, giving financial incentives to the platform participants, that's one piece of it. I think the other piece of it that is perhaps more validated, and we're seeing that play out now with Blue Sky and Twitter, is the platform versus protocol. So, Blue Sky is not giving me money for sending out posts or anything like that. But there is this element of anyone in theory could go and create their own client. And so I think that, decentralization is like this huge term that can mean so many different things. I personally hit a wall when it comes to like just human behavior and incentive design of these networks. I still think the protocol piece is interesting. I will say the conclusion, if I had to like sum it up, is that decentralization and or having a token does not absolve you from the responsibility of building something people want. And so, when we think about what we are building, sure, the end game can be a human curated search engine, but the reason people use it is because what we're building is going to be a fantastic tool to collect and connect all of the insights you find interesting online and stitch it together with other people's brains. So it's this like networked way of building a second brain. Sure, like the end goal is still the same, but the way to get there is by building a product that has a ton of utility versus, offering financial incentives and things like that, I just think that can be Band-Aid solutions for actually building something people want.
Yeah, I think the human curation piece is super interesting. And I have a few follow-up questions to that. I think the first is with regards to scale, right? So people like you mentioned, you like to curate your own content. You know, you've been doing this for a long time. I'm the same way. If I find an article that I find to be useful or helpful, I just add it to my notes app on my phone. But nobody has access to my notes app on my phone except for me. So that information doesn't get shared. And like you were saying, how awesome would it be? You know, how much more knowledge and insight could we have if I had access to your notes app and you had access to mine and we had access to all the other people out there who do the same thing we do and collect their own little tidbits of knowledge and information. But then I think the question is, you know, is that scalable? Like how many people are actually doing that out there and how many people are doing it in a similar way, right? So like, what if I looked at your notes app and I thought, oh, this is so great. I love this content that Sari is collecting. But then you look at my notes app and you're like, wow, this is like really shit content actually. And like, I can't believe this is the stuff that she finds to be insightful. Then you don't want to follow me anymore. But if we're curating content on the same platform, I guess I'm just curious, like, how do you maintain that level of quality that, you know, how do you determine the level of quality that people want to see? And how do you maintain that level once you determine what that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the sort of quality stuff is not too different from what other platforms have done. So there's a lot of junk on, whatever, Pinterest or Instagram or whatever, but there are tools to, in each platform with their own sort of like different incentive, but to try to pull the best content to the top. So I don't think that we need to do anything radically different. I think that, for us, like when we think about what we're building, the number of connections is a really interesting proxy for quality. So there's this given piece. Diana connected it to her library. I connected it to mine. If it's in a bunch of people's libraries, that's a pretty decent proxy for quality. It's sort of like what Google did with PageRank, but based on like people's human curated libraries. So I think there are a lot of effective ways to deal with the quality issue that are not necessarily unique to us. I think the scale question is really interesting because, of course, like there's just no way that we can index the entirety of the web. And, I think the thing that I always go back to, and this also ties into business model, is we're not optimizing for scale. We're optimizing for resonance. And I do think that if we, like my aspiration is to build the first social tool powered by a freemium model, not an advertising model. And so, if you have this like freemium model where people fall in love and then pay, there's this question of like, what do you charge for? And so if you charge for the tool, which is the supply side, then the tool has to be really good. If you charge for the demand, like the content, then, scale is really important. So I do think that I'm not too concerned right now about covering every corner of content. I think that the value proposition of a human curated search engine is precisely like the opposite of like the index everything. I think that, over time, as more people contribute to this, then, because the reality is that I don't expect a lot of people's queries to begin on Startupy. I expect a lot of people's queries to begin on Google because we're not going to change behavior overnight. But if we can, if over time, like we can rank high across a lot of these topics, then, I sort of, the way I look at it is like this is a multi-decade project for us. And so I'm not concerned about scale. I'm concerned about resonance and setting the culture and the tone and the vibe for the kind of internet we want to have and just building a fantastic tool that will incentivize people to want to share their notes and links and insights on this platform. And, I think that that's been a learning where I think initially I thought that the incentive would be sort of financial and maybe like, an NFT ownership. And, I think those things can help, but they don't absolve you of the responsibility to build a great product.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, we've mentioned Startupy a lot already. I want to take a step back and tell people what Startupy is for people who aren't familiar. So, tell us, what does the current evolution of Startupy look like as a platform? And people can already use this, and so people can go on to Startupy world and already look at the content that's been curated there. But I'm curious, just to hear from you, the 30,000 foot level of what Startupy is, how you guys pick your curators, how the content is curated, all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So lots to share there. So basically, Startupy is a community of people that are curating and interconnecting incredible content on the web. It was basically born off of this obsession with curating content and wanting to extend what I was doing personally and do that more communal in a more communal way. And I think what we learned along the way is that like people we had tapped into the zeitgeist for sure, in the sense that people want curated content no matter what, in a world where AI can give us all this, we still want to see how people, the personal side of information. What does Diana resonate with? How is she connecting these things? And of course, AI can augment some of that, but it will never truly replace the value of tying information to identity and humans and all this stuff. And so we started off with this very humble attempt at building a community that was finding the needle in the haystack and indexing in this interface that is searchable and available for others. I think the thing that we've been relentlessly focused for the last 6 months is taking everything we learned in the process of building this community to build what we think is going to be a world-class tool that essentially allows you to build your second brain, but in a more networked way. And what I mean by that is you will still have the same utility of tools that allow you to, take notes, store links, images, quotes, whatever on the internet, but you build this library inside of a living, breathing network where your ideas can bump into others, where you can share your library. We love the metaphor of trails to describe what we're building, because a trail is something that is very useful for you. It makes your personal sort of internet more generative, more useful, more alive, but it's also something you leave behind for others, giving them jumping off points to research and wander and create their own trails. And so I think the thing we've been obsessing over is, if we manage to create a tool that is equal parts personal and communal, meaning there is a lot of utility for you, but it's built inside this living network, then over time, this tool can become a human curated search engine, because it is the home for a lot of people's sort of most interesting thoughts, links, and sparks of inspiration, and it becomes searchable. And so my sort of thesis continues to be that a lot of this knowledge is stuck in single player tools. And, meanwhile, a lot of the web is deteriorating in quality, and it's all sort of a lot of garbage and SEO optimized. And, I think we need a lot of choice. As I said earlier, there is room for this more authoritative, scalable internet, but there's also room for this more beautifully human and chaotic and personal internet. And so, we've been just obsessing over what that looks like. And, I'm finally now emerging from the rabbit hole, and really proud of, I think, where we landed, because I think if Startupy was very focused on seeding the early community, I think Sublime, which is the evolution of Startupy, is very focused on actually building a product that actually serves this mission really well.
Yeah. So I took a look at Startupy just last night as I was preparing for this interview, and the content I found there was actually super insightful. I started just going through and flagging all these, copying all these links to articles that were curated there and adding it to my notes app, like how I curate content for myself. And then I was like, I just need to come back to this one day and read all of it, because I found myself copying and pasting every single link on there into my notes app. So I'm curious, and I saw there was a link too to all the curators that you have on Startupy. How do you go about finding these curators, and how do you go about vetting the curators that you want to have a say in what content shows up on Startupy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the who curates the curators is obviously an important question. I think the answer thus far is that the curators have found us. I think we've tried to our approach has been, put a manifesto out, share your vision of the internet with the world. And, that's been sort of a magnet for attracting the kinds of people. And when we ask them, why do you want to be a part of Startupy? It's always we're just drawn to the mission. So it's self-selected for high quality people, just given the size. It's our community of curators is now just over 500, although the broader Startupy user base is about 30,000 people. And, I do think that the who curates the curators, it's it shouldn't be a decision that is on us. I believe, and with Sublime, when we launch, anyone can create and curate content, and it's sort of up to the network and to people to have a choice of deciding who they follow. And so, yeah, I think this is obviously a big, important question on the internet right now. You have algorithmic curation, where, on TikTok, anyone can post on TikTok, but there's an algorithm that decides like who they actually amplify. And so in some ways that's algorithmic curation. There's the Substack model where, it's 100% up to you, although they're introducing some sort of algorithms, but it's really like up to you to decide who to trust. So the platform sort of absolves itself of the responsibility of deciding or censorship and I sort of lean into, I don't think it's healthy for a society where networks are making a lot of these important sort of like censorship and moderation decisions. I think that a lot of this power should be in the hands of users over time. I think the challenge is that humans are complex. We want everything. We want simple to use products, but we want to have governance over them. But then when push comes to shove, we don't have time to govern these platforms. And so it's tricky. And I think that, we're still sort of like learning our way, I think generally on the internet, as far as best practices. But I do think a lot of my time has gone into studying what's gone well and what hasn't when it comes to the properties of a lot of these sort of internet products. So for example, once you make vanity metrics, a big part of it, or what is like the impact of engagement-based business models on the kinds of content that gets shared. And so I think that I'm excited about a new wave of products that just has a clearer understanding of how a lot of the product decisions that were made in the early internet panned out. Even like I think back to Jack Dorsey, founder of Twitter. He had an interview a few years back where he said that if he could do anything differently, he would have hired a game designer because he didn't know when they introduced the quote retweet button what that would do to the product. I mean, we're humans making decisions with imperfect information. And so, a lot of these things, I don't think they come from a place of evil. I think they just come from a place of like limited understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, it sounds like Sublime, which is the evolution of Startupy. It's the same thing as Startupy, but it's what you guys are launching, I think, in June, right? So maybe a month or so down the line. It sounds to me what Sublime is using, the model that Sublime is using, is kind of a mix of this algorithmic model and a purely like human curated model. So on the one hand, if I want to follow people, I can follow people and I can have, curate my own home feed to only the people that I want to follow. But on the other hand, there is also maybe another home feed where I can, or another feed where I can go and look at all the algorithmically curated content that Startupy or that Sublime curated. Is that right?
Yeah. So everything on Sublime is added by people. So meaning like nothing, I guess, much like other UGC platforms, it's not like we're passively scraping the web and indexing every site. So everything belongs or can be ultimately tracked to somebody adding it to their own personal library. There is a follow model. There is like a basic explore model. We lean very heavily into search, but yes, fundamentally, that is the model. I think that, what we aspire to is to combine the sort of focus and utility of a productivity tool with the sense of aliveness of a social network. So I think earlier I said that the problem with social networks is that they've become more sort of like places to perform than they are places to communicate. And so the incentive, you don't tweet something unless you think it's going to resonate with your audience. You're sort of like performing for an audience. I think with Sublime, the metaphor is slightly different. The idea is that you are sort of like building an archive for yourself, but leaving it behind for others in case they resonate. And so I think to really nail that, it necessitates a degree of like remove the vanity metrics and just like make sure that the mechanics, like remove all of the like performative mechanics, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then with regards to the search model, then if say I go and I search for something kind of, very broad and vague, like let's say I search how to decide what to do with my life on Startupy, and there are 20 different articles that people have curated on Startupy that address this topic. How does Startupy then decide which of these to show at the top of the search versus at the bottom?
Totally. So I think that like what we are developing is like our version of PageRank is based on metrics that are unique to Sublime. So in our case, if a given article is in a lot of people's libraries, then that is very relevant to our system. And so, in some ways, like you could argue that can be gamed, but I think it can be gamed far less than SEO, in the sense that if you wanted to make your article appear at the top of Sublime, I mean, there are more metrics other than the number of connections, but you'd have to create like 25 accounts, and like you'd be flagged. And so, because it's tied to a human identity, it's slightly different. And the other piece of it is that like it is going to be a freemium model, so which I think hasn't been tried before as much in social, in the sense that we win when we build a tool that is so useful for you that it's just like it changes the nature of the mechanics. But to be clear, like we are building this like human page rank.
Gotcha. With regards to the content that's curated on Startupy, I think at first glance, I only noticed written content. Is that something that you guys want to keep with Sublime? Is it's only open to written content, or are you also open to multimedia, videos, podcasts, other types of content?
Oh my gosh, yes. That's a big flaw of the current Startupy site. We're super excited when we unveil Sublime. It's just been very, very thoughtfully just designed to support multimedia curation.
Amazing. And is it going to be focused mostly on long form content, which is what I noticed is currently, or will it be focused on like the YouTube shorts, the TikTok style videos, things like that? Because as we know, like I think, one of the biggest challenges I think with knowledge share today is that people's attention span has become so short. And so the content that I personally find to be most useful is long form content. But I think, it's just so much more difficult in this day and age to even get people's attention for long enough to get them to consume that long form content.
Yeah. I mean, it would be very like idealistic of me to think that we can change the shortening attention spans. The reality is that we do think about how to make the atomic unit the insight, right? Because of course you could share an article. If you see that article in a feed, it might take you 20 minutes to read that article. And so I don't think that providing a long list of links is particularly helpful in most cases. Like people just want the insights quickly. And I think that that's the reason we've gravitated towards these products that we just like have become these like lab rats that are constantly like, pressing levers to get these like tiny pellets of intellectual or social nourishment. And I think that if we can do that with more sort of intellectually nourishing content, like that is what we're optimizing for. So to be clear, on Sublime, we emphasize like highlights, like as we've redesigned the interface, what we've done is like, because Sublime is all about collecting content and connecting it to different sort of ideas, we've made the atomic unit of like the insight to the highlight, the image, whatever, remixable on its own, so that the insight can travel and be connected to different sort of like nodes within the network. So I like 100% agree that attention spans are shortening. We can't fight that. I do think, though, that if you think about the architecture of Sublime, so there's no question that the internet is deteriorating our capacity for deep thinking. I think that, deep thought requires just like sustained solitude. And I remember like back in the day when I used to tweet a lot and I'd have a tweet go viral, I would just like spend the day like refreshing my Twitter. I was like, how do people go viral every day? This is crazy. And so with Sublime, it's, in the same way that like every social network that now looks the same has likes and comments and bookmarks and views, like on Sublime, you have a number of connections. And so the difference there is that is more conducive to deep thought, because you're not just seeing a number that, sort of doesn't mean anything, but the connections that you see actually pull you further down the rabbit hole and expose you to different perspectives of the same topic. Because the issue with Twitter is that, you see one tweet about, Trump, and another tweet about Ukraine, and another tweet about some new startup, and another, and, our brains are just not equipped to context shift in this way. And so, I have like just a lot of like views on how to just make small design changes that actually seem small, but actually change the nature of the way people communicate on these platforms.
I love that. I agree with all of that. It's so hard to focus and think on the internet nowadays because of it's just like the information is firing at you from all angles and you don't even know what to do with it because, like you said, our brains aren't programmed to context switch so fast from across vastly different topics, right? And it's like 1 second I'm like seeing stuff on crypto Twitter about like ZK Sync and I'm like, oh, that looks so cool, I should research this. And then I scroll like a little bit more and I see another tweet about decentralized search and I'm like, oh, but that's so cool too. And I go on a rabbit hole about this. And then at the end of the day, like I've learned absolutely nothing. I've just like thought, for 3 seconds about 20 different topics.
100%. And so but at the same time, when I think that the Center for Humane Technology did the study on what tools or apps make people feel good. And a lot of the ones that make people feel good are, personal apps, whether it was like, I think it was Evernote and Calm. And then a lot of the stuff that made us feel bad were these multiplayer social apps. And I actually think the wrong takeaway is that social apps are bad. I think that the right takeaway is that we've designed social apps to help us behave in certain ways that are conducive to performance and not think about it this way. When I write an article on my Substack or whatever, like to me, the metric of success is how many interesting conversations do I have as a result of that? It has nothing to do with how many likes it has or how many comments it gets or, those are all just like cheap metrics. Because if I connect with one interesting person as a result of that either ends up becoming my friend or investing in my company or, just like shedding light on some unique insight, that is really valuable. But I think that which means that if we're just in private silos, we are like losing out on those opportunities. But these social products, unless you're just like really good at ignoring the distractions, they are not conducive to like meaning making and connections because it's so performative.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a key point. The last thing I wanted to ask you about Startupy is, I think I found this on your Twitter bio, is this Ask Sari page. So the idea behind this is that any person, and you've got one, Ask Sari, it's basically somebody can search for anything on this Ask Sari page and go into your brain about, like this topic, whatever they want to search for. So if I wanted to search for, how do I figure out what to do with my life? I could go on Ask Sari and search that. And if you've curated any articles or content on this topic or thought about it in any way, I could see the content that you've curated on it. So say, I think, I'm like, Sari has really got her life figured out. Like she must really know what to do with her life. And I want to know how she figured that out. So I'm going to go on her page and search this and get access to her knowledge base. Is this a product that will also be transferred into Sublime? And talk a little bit more about that. Like, tell me too if I'm off on it. This has just been my observation from looking at one link on it, but
totally.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm super glad you asked. So, it's interesting that a lot of what we've seen happen with AI allows us to do things with a few API calls that, 2 years ago would have required like a full team of machine learning engineers. So that Ask Sari URL in my Twitter bio is an example of basically me taking every article link that I've curated along with my highlights on them, putting them in one sort of, basically using, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, but using OpenAI's embeddings. And essentially what that does is, without using keywords, using just like semantic natural language search, it'll show you, if you type in a question like, what do I want to do with my life? What else has Sari curated that is related to this topic? And it just uses like large language models like OpenAI and Hugging Face. And so that was an experiment. It worked really well. And so Sublime is definitely going to be intelligent. We are going to incorporate natural language search. We're going to incorporate semantic similarity. You should be able to query your second brain in natural language. But I think more interestingly, if you sort of take a step back and you look at ChatGPT and some of these other tools, they're intelligent, but they lack context, your personal context, and they lack sort of like awareness of your own knowledge. But if you think about, if you like somebody like me that has actually cultivated this repository over the years, I could very easily spin up a version of ChatGPT where I am talking to my own thoughts. And I could say, you know what? I am going to write a manifesto for Sublime, tap into everything that I've curated on this collection and help me write the manifesto. So I can be assisted by AI, but it's still using like my own context. And so we very much like believe that, there's like a by AI and there's a with AI. I think that AI as an augmented thinking partner is really interesting. And I hope that sort of like camp of empowering humans becomes like just much more prevalent than the, like just fakery and everything by AI and like humans are no longer needed. But anyway, all this to say that was like an early experiment we made with AI, and a lot of that thinking is baked into Sublime, which we'll be launching in the next couple months.
So fascinating. I think that stuff is super, super cool. And I think just the limits of what we can do with something like ChatGPT or just AI in general is endless. And we're only barely scraping the surface of what we can uncover with that. Like ChatGPT as it stands today is like such a basic version of that. And, the application that you found with this Ask Sari page is just, I think, so much more powerful than what people are imagining with ChatGPT. So super cool. Sari, are there any final thoughts you have on Sublime or on just decentralized search or content curation in general that we have not covered that you want to make sure listeners can learn today?
I would just say that I think that it's like time that we raise the bar when it comes to like what we expect from the internet. I think there was this post swimming around the web on the age of average and how everything looks the same. And I think the same is true for how we interact online. And, I'm excited to share like one different like point of view on how that can manifest. But, I hope a lot more people do it, because I don't think it's about like hating on what's there and complaining about what's there. I think it's about presenting like provocative alternatives. And that's certainly what I spent the last year working on. And now I've got a chip on my shoulder to make it work.
We deserve more, and we can have our cake and eat it too, is what you're saying. And I'm totally on board with that. So last thing, Sari, on every episode, we end with a quick little game. It's just a rapid fire word association game. So I've got about 50 slips of paper in this tin here in front of me, and I'm going to draw 10 of these at random. These are all, the words on these slips of paper are all misused or overused words in Web3. So they should all sound pretty familiar to you if you spend a lot of time on Twitter at all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the word off the piece of paper, and you're going to say the first word that comes to mind. Okay? The only rule is you can't say the same word I just said, and you can't say the same word for every word I say. So you can't just like answer Startupy with like every word I say. Cool. Does that make sense?
Let's try it out.
Okay, great. So I've got 10 now in front of me. And the first one is identity.
I think about pseudonymous.
Nice. Media.
I think about knowledge, information versus knowledge when I think of media.
Okay. Deflationary.
I think buzzword.
Privacy.
Overblown.
Zero knowledge.
Infinite knowledge.
Composable.
Legos.
Concentric circles.
I think like visuals.
Community.
The only thing that matters.
Merkle tree.
Have no idea.
And last one, layer 2.
More layers.
Awesome. Good job. You did, believe it or not, you did a great job. Some people really struggled through that game, but we got through it pretty fast. So awesome. I hope you enjoyed it and it wasn't too painful.
Oh my gosh, that was painful. I was like,
oh no, I'm sorry.
I have to put like, what am I saying? But that was fun.
You did great. So last thing, Sari, before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you, and also where people can go to learn more about Startupy and make sure that they're aware when Sublime launches and how they can sign up for that.
Yeah, for sure. So, Sublime will be launching soon, but the best way to get notified is to follow Startupy. I send out a weekly newsletter at startupy.substack.com. You can follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/Sari Azout. You can also follow Startupy on Twitter, twitter.com/startupyworld.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and we'll be back again next Thursday with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and sponsored by Lens, Empire Wallet, and NFT.storage. Rehash is also supported by Rehash DAO, a community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes a part of Rehash DAO and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. Voting rights are reserved for our guests, sponsors, and OG crowdfund supporters. And to learn more about how to become a guest or sponsor, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at rehashweb3, or on Lens at rehash.lens.